don't think we've, okay, we've got the mics on. So we are rolling right into our next session. Want to introduce Jane Holl Lute and Matt Olsen. Jane was the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. Deputy Homeland Security Secretary. And Matt ran the Counterterrorism Center, is now the Deputy Attorney General for National Security, runs the National Security Division. I'm sorry, Assistant Attorney General runs the National Security Division. If our Deputy Attorney General is still out in the crowd, Lisa, I apologize. We promoted Matt too rapidly here. And both of them have deep experience in cyber issues. Jane went on to do all kinds of interesting cyber work after she left government. Matt worked for IronNet, startup, and then was at Uber for a number of years working on their cyber issues. So the first thing I want to ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Jane, is out of the fascinating conversation with Ann Neuberger, what did you hear that was new and different from when you were in office dealing with these issues in the Obama administration?
Thanks, David. And it's really a pleasure to be at Aspen, and I want to begin by acknowledging the presence I feel of Brent Scowcroft, who first brought me here in 1994, and whose personal example, personal politics, and way he led his life was a commitment not only to this country, but to each other and to bipartisanship, which I feel radiating in the room as well.
I think we all of us at the Aspen Strategy Group deeply miss Brent, who I think this is the first session that started without him. What we don't miss is that into his late 80s, Brent would lead a hike up the mountain out here where those of us who were several decades younger were struggling to keep up.
That's true. So what's different now than 10 years ago in the Obama administration? What's really striking to me is how natural now a Homeland Security lens comes to the conversation. That was really not true 10 years ago. We brought a national security lens, an international security lens, and frankly, all of these issues, whether it's cybersecurity or terrorism or the role of the United States in the world, looks very different from a Homeland perspective rather than a national security perspective.
Give us an example of that from your time. Obviously, during your time in the Obama administration, we had the Russians, for example, going after government communications. The White House, you'll remember, White House email systems, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and others. And yet at the time, my recollection was it was regarded a little bit as nations spy on each other. There wasn't as much of a focus, as we were discussing with Ann Neuberger before, on the destructive level of activity. In retrospect, should we have thought about the Russian threat differently from that time?
Yeah, you know, retrospect is
a wonderful thing.
Afforded to the winners, right?
Yeah.
So I would say the following. You know, we were at points, it was characterized to me, in hand-to-hand combat with NSA over the narrative, our theory of the case when it came to cybersecurity. How would we describe what we were encountering and how we should respond to it? And I remember thinking at the time, you know, there are really only three interesting questions when it comes to cybersecurity. How do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Number two, how do we safeguard our information and our identity in an open internet? And number three, what should the role of government be? And when you think about national security, it's strategic, it's centralized, and top-driven. Can you think of any three more useless words in the English language to describe the internet than strategic, centralized, and top-driven? And Homeland Security is transactional, it's decentralized, it's bottom-driven, it's driven by the municipalities, the states in this country. And it's a much more organic approach to the challenges and the opportunities presented in cyberspace.
Matt, you find yourself coming back into government, having dealt with many of these issues a few years ago, and back into the Justice Department after having dealt with these issues years ago. What do you feel is different, and what did you hear from our discussion with Ms. Neuberger that seemed different to you?
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks, everybody. Look, we were all sat here and listened to Ann Neuberger talk, and in response to that question, a couple things come to mind in terms of what's changed since I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, almost 10 years ago. I mean, first of all, as you say, Jane, we were really trying to figure out how to organize the government when it came to cybersecurity. I had been the general counsel at NSA, and I worked with Ann at NSA before, and you used the word hand-to-hand combat. I mean, I saw that as well. And think about how far we've come in what Ann has just described in terms of how the government is organized to take on threats in cyberspace, where you now have CISA, led by Jen Easterly. You have a national cyber director, led by Chris Inglis, and you have Ann Neuberger as a deputy national security advisor. And you have these conversations taking place where the president is talking, as Ann described, and asking questions about how our cyber capabilities, both on the offensive and defensive side, fit into a broader national strategy. And the unity of effort, the level of collaboration, and the way the government is organized is just a sea change from several years ago. So that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of what I learned, and I think what we all learned from the last session, is what we are seeing in Ukraine in terms of Russia's cyber attacks. There's sort of a view that Russia hasn't taken many steps in Ukraine in terms of cyber, and I think listening to Ann talk about destructive attacks, wiper viruses, wiper malware by Russia attacking Ukrainian systems, that really puts that idea to the myth. It shows that that's a myth, and we are effectively seeing a hot cyber war in Ukraine carried out by the Russians. And I think that's a lesson and a takeaway from much of these conversations we're hearing today.
Matt, we had a brief conversation, Ann referred to, and I did, to this action that the FBI took, where they went and removed basically the shells from malware from companies in the United States, and I think perhaps some outside the United States as well, using the powers that you get from a search warrant. Now, a search warrant, most people think of, enables you to search. I can go in and, get records back, unless it happens to be the Secret Service, but others, by and large. Okay. But you were using them, in this case, for a different purpose. You were actually going in to remove code. Tell us a little bit about that. Pretty innovative use.
First of all, David continues to gain his reputation for being incorrigible.
Yeah.
And we knew that, so going in. But yes, so look, big picture, Justice Department, we're the biggest law enforcement law firm in the world. Our traditional role, whether it's illegal cyber activity or other illegal activities, is to investigate and prosecute, and that's what people know us for the most. But in cyber, you've seen the FBI and the Justice Department being more proactive in trying to mitigate or stop cyber threats before they become manifest. And the Hafnium attack, or the Hafnium malware in connection with the Microsoft Exchange servers, that was an instance where the government, the FBI, used its Rule 41 search warrants authority. And similarly, and more recently, just 2 months ago, a proactive operation to go after malware associated with Russian military intelligence called Cyclops Blink, which was basically a botnet. It infected thousands of computers. The FBI used its search warrant authority to remove that malware from the command and control layer, basically making it impossible for the Russian military intelligence actors to control that botnet. So how does that work? So you talked about search warrants as the ability to search. It's also the authority to seize. So search and seizure warrants allowed the government, the FBI, to not only search and find where this malware existed, but to seize it. Just like if the government knew about a burglar who had carried out a burglary, you could seize the instruments of those crimes. The lockpick, for example, the FBI seized the malware from those command and control servers in the recent Cyclops Blink attack, and actually changed the firewall rules to prevent the command and control from being able to allow those individuals to gain access and control the botnet. So it's innovative, I agree, and it's using a traditional authority, but I think it's an important step in the government-wide effort to be more proactive in this space.
You know, I think it's really a good illustration, too, of the importance of getting the government's act together that Ann talked so effectively about. When you talk about offensive cyber, I mean, Matt just gave you a good picture on how it can be deployed in an effective way. I mean, but there's also sort of an international component to it, as we've seen with Russia and the war in Ukraine. I made a smart aleck remark when people said, why aren't we seeing more Russian mischief, you know, or attacks? I said, half the damn gangs were Ukrainians. I mean, you know, Ukrainian was my mother's first language, so this was pretty interesting to me. But while Matt and you may be looking at it from that point of view, I'm looking at it from, again, through a Homeland lens. And if you think we live in a free fire zone now in this country because of arms, wait till you see how we react when people try to extend Second Amendment rights to cyber arms. The ability to keep and bear cyber offensive weapons. And that, to me, is coming, and we've not even really begun to think about it.
It's a really fascinating concept from which I would suggest that next year we do a completely separate panel. Jane, you and Matt have both raised China, so I want to turn to that. And given the fact that we're so focused the past 5 or 6 months on Ukraine, I feel like sometimes we have lost focus on the fact that, you know, China is the long-term and what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. So Matt, when you came into the National Security Division, you inherited something called the China Initiative, which had gone largely after academics and had what I think the Justice Department refers to politely as a mixed record of convictions. Tell us what you found and what's happened to that initiative. I know there were announcements that would be changed, and you're trying to take a little bit of a broader approach on China. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, and you know, to your question and your sort of tee up there, there's no doubt from whether it's the DNI or the FBI director, the Pentagon, there's just no doubt that China continues to pose the preeminent threat to our economic and national security long term. And those threats from the PRC manifest in a number of different ways. They obviously manifest in cyber-enabled espionage, theft of trade secrets, economic espionage, transnational repression. You know, so we at the Justice Department in our role are very focused on that wide range of threats that we face.
Tell us a little more about the transnational repression. It's a really interesting.
Sure, I use that term, I should explain. So when we talk about transnational repression, we're talking about what countries like China and what the PRC is doing to suppress and silence dissidents here in the United States. And we just brought 3 cases, in fact, a couple months ago, 3 criminal prosecutions we announced against individuals connected to the PRC and Chinese intelligence for their role in harassing, intimidating, stalking dissidents in the United States, including somebody who was a potential candidate for Congress. We think there are, we know of dozens of these cases. We think there are actually hundreds. And so this is a burgeoning threat, and it does reflect, I think, a broader effort by the PRC to extend its, its influence outside of its borders. So look, just to finish up your first question, we looked at the nature of the Chinese threat, and to be clear, when we talk about this, we're talking about the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people, and certainly not people of Chinese descent and Chinese Americans. And we wanted to be very clear that when we looked at this China initiative, that what we're talking about when we think of how the Justice Department is tackling this threat is the broad array of ways in which China poses a threat to the United States' national security, and that's how we sort of changed our focus.
But just back on the China initiative for a moment, in many of those cases, you were able to prove fraud. I'm not sure I was persuaded, looking at those cases, that you proved that there was an effort by the Chinese government to infiltrate campuses in an effort to steal intellectual property and so forth. Am I right? And is that part of why it is that you are broadening this?
Well, I think it's clear that when we look, we looked at those cases. We did look to see whether they were strong cases involving fraud, basically academic fraud. Some of those cases were not as strong as others. We want to make sure that we're bringing really strong cases when we prosecute someone at the Justice Department. But the key was those cases got a lot of attention, and the key was that the threat from China in terms of economic espionage, the transnational repression I talked about, cyber-enabled espionage, and other influence operations, that's where we need to be focusing our efforts.
Jane, I wanted to ask you a little bit about China issues, because in your time at Homeland Security was just the beginning of the time when the U.S. was beginning to rethink the CFIUS rules. This is the committee that looks at Chinese investment in the United States. Those have since been amended so that you can have investigations. There are many more now than there were, I think, in your time there. You can have investigations just based on a minority stake that the Chinese government takes or a Chinese entity takes. You can have cases involving investment in venture capital. What needs to be done from this point forward? And how do you do this without it looking like you were back in a sort of McCarthy era in which all investment from China is suspect?
So a couple of things. One, the C in CFIUS, it stands for committee, not for China. It's the Committee on Foreign Investment, committee, right? Yeah, on foreign investment in the United States. And it's for all transactions involving foreign investors, not just the Chinese. I'll tell you a small story. When I was the deputy, I was going to Sherpa. I went to China with a delegation to Sherpa what we hoped would be a ministerial between the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Interior Ministry and Ministry for Safety and Security. That ministerial didn't happen. But I dutifully called up Kurt Campbell over at the State Department, who was the Assistant Secretary for Asian Affairs, and said, Kurt, I'd like to get a briefing on, I'm going to China. We can't go there without talking to you guys. And he said, Jane, you're getting meetings we have never been able to get. You're meeting people we have never been able to see. And they were curious about Homeland Security, about that face of the US government that they had never seen. I was invited to the western border. They love the Coast Guard. They were very interested in how we approach natural disasters and massive disaster response. So we had a lot of things to talk about. And in the CFIUS process specifically, what we really learned is that it was not designed for software. When we were buying and selling software, there was major investment in this country in software. Once it's gone through a due diligence process, it's gone. And so the whole thing had to really be rethought, which was done, and it was not done just for the Chinese. The Chinese have a lot of company out there, and people used to divide it up pretty simply. The Chinese want information and advantage. The Russians want to destabilize. Russian gangs want to get rich, and the Iranians are opportunists. That again comes from a national security lens, not the Homeland Security lens.
Matt, one more for you before we go on to look at some domestic terrorism issues. I wanted to ask you about what is sort of generally referred to as the TikTok problem, but it's more than just TikTok. And I know TikTok's an active, subject of investigation, so I don't expect you to be able to talk about the company that much, but I'm hoping you can talk about the category of problem, which is we have a highly successful, some might say highly addictive form of software and an app that is on probably more than 100 million American telephones. You are unlikely to get teenagers across America to give up TikTok because somebody's given a speech saying it's a national security threat, although I would be really amused to cover it if you tried. Okay. And yet the problem is that you can't opt out, and the algorithms are all written in China, so there's great visibility to data on the phones, behavioral data. So tell us how you're thinking about this category of problem.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. David, from your description, by the way, I'm going to look to see what you may have on TikTok. Just your familiarity with it suggests that you're a very active user.
The dance routines will really,
the dance routines,
you'll really love those, Matt.
Right.
Yeah.
So, people should know when Jane, Lute, and I were in the government before, Jane was the most important leader on Homeland Security that I worked with on an ongoing basis. And I would say we almost never talked about CFIUS. I'm not sure we ever talked about CFIUS. Today, if we were together today, CFIUS, this process of reviewing foreign investment in U.S. companies, we would be talking about it. And we do talk about about these issues with our partners at Homeland Security and Treasury and Commerce, all members, the Defense Department, all members of this committee that's involved in these reviews. And The basic authority gives us the ability to review these transactions to determine whether they pose risks to U.S. national security, and it's a broad authority. The types of risks we're concerned about are the passage of sensitive technology, for example, or supply chain risks to the United States, or risks to personal data of U.S. citizens. And the process and the authorities allow the government to, in some cases, really the extreme cases, to actually block the transaction, stop it from occurring. But in most cases, the authorities allow the government to impose mitigation that protects national security in the context of the transaction if it goes forward. And the types of mitigation we would look at when it comes to risks to U.S. citizen data, and there's obviously reason to be concerned about companies that are closely aligned with the PRC, because those companies are in China and they're subject to Chinese national security laws, which gives the government broad authority to access this information. But the kinds of mitigation we look at can be things such as the governance structure when a new company is created or after the investment occurs, that provides some distance between the investment company, the Chinese company, for example, or another country's company, and the United States. That provides that distance to give us some comfort that the new company will have some degree of independence. Proxy boards, for example, are one such technique. The other are technical solutions in terms of data storage and cybersecurity that help protect U.S. national security. But it's a very robust process that allows for a wide range of innovative solutions to address the types of concerns that we see from foreign investment in the United States.
Jane, you're the mother of a teenage daughter. Tell us, is TikTok here a parenting problem or is it a national security problem?
It's a wonderful country.
No, really, any thoughts about how we approach this issue of the data being held in China?
So the Lutes have no secrets. I think we all just need to realize that all of our data is out there.
Yeah.
And how it's being used. I mean, when I'm on the board of an energy company and people say, isn't climate change the worst threat in the world? And I always say, well, it's third to me. I'm not trying to be a smart aleck. I mean, the biggest threat to me in the world is that we will lose faith in each other. That is the biggest threat the world faces, is that we will lose faith in each other. The second biggest threat is exponential weaponry. I mean, there's enormous destructive power in individual hands, and frankly, the only government in the planet that has even remotely an approach for dealing with it, it's the Chinese. And we may not like that, right? There is the data, and there is what you do with it. I mean, I said to you earlier, my second question dealing with cybersecurity is how do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identity in an open internet? And that's the frontier we're at.
Matt, moving to domestic terrorism issues for a bit and the January 6th issues that have come up. You had a really interesting filing the other day in which it was a sentencing memo for someone who had been convicted in the January 6th attacks, a particularly brutal element, I think an attack on a police officer. And the Justice Department asked for the first time for a special designation of this convicted defendant as a terrorist so that you could get a higher or longer sentence. I can't imagine 10 years ago the uproar that would come about had you declared in court that a right-wing organization was essentially harboring terrorists. But tell us a little bit about the decision.
Sure, and just taking a step back, and I mean, again, we work together on terrorism primarily, and certainly domestic terrorism was part of the picture, but it's changed significantly since I was last in government, and we've just seen an incredible rise in the challenge of domestic terrorism. We now have a White House strategy, first ever, issued last year, how to tackle the challenge of domestic terrorism, and January 6th is an example of an investigation that the FBI has called a domestic terrorism investigation. That doesn't mean that everybody that went into the Capitol that committed a crime that day is a so-called domestic terrorist, but it does mean that we are looking at this very singular event, this intolerable attack on our democracy, as a domestic terrorism investigation. The filing you're referencing is there was an individual who was convicted of obstructing Congress and weapons offenses. He drove to the Capitol from Texas with an AR-15 and a .40 caliber gun. He was coming to take members of Congress. And we filed a memo in court for the first time asking the court to impose a higher sentence, a 15-year sentence, based on our assertion that this was an act of domestic terrorism, meaning it was an act of violence that was intended to affect government policy through intimidation or coercion. Our view is that these acts, as proven in court, clearly meet that definition of terrorism, and therefore a higher sentence is warranted. And this is the first time we've sought this terrorism sentence in any of the cases stemming from this sprawling investigation involving at this point, more than 800 arrests and dozens of convictions.
So Matt, a step you haven't taken yet is one the Canadians took not long ago when they declared, I believe, that the Proud Boys, maybe one other group, were terrorist organizations in their mind. Hard thing to do in the United States when we've got First Amendment issues underway here and so forth. Tell us about that.
Well, you put your finger right on it. I mean, one of the challenges in the space of domestic terrorism versus international terrorism, where we're talking about foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we're talking about groups based in the United States where we have our cherished freedoms of expression and association, the right to petition the government. And so identifying where an extremist, for example, a domestic violent extremist who is espousing hateful, racist, anti-government rhetoric, which is protected by the First Amendment, no matter how vile it may be, where that person moves from a position of protected conduct to engaging in acts of violence, which is the key line, and therefore committing a criminal act. So that's because of our protections, because of our values around the First Amendment, we don't name or designate domestic groups as terrorist organizations. That doesn't mean we don't have the tools. We do have the criminal tools to go after them, but we obviously have to be very careful in how we talk about these groups and the tools that we use to investigate them.
So I think, David, just two very quick points which illustrate the difference with Homeland Security, right? I mean, we're talking about essentially, mostly, young men who come from everywhere, who will go anywhere because they feel like they belong nowhere. I mean, this is what we got wrong 10 years ago in thinking about this problem. We now know a lot more about the behavioral aspects of this and the desire to connect to meaning and the desire to express the anger that exists in these individuals through violence. We know a ton more, and the government's come together on that. So again, it's just an illustration of how you need both lenses to really understand and deal with these problems.
Well, we could take this conversation on for a long time. I want to thank you both for it's been a really fascinating and illuminating talk, and look forward to the rest of the conference with all of you. Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you.
All right, give us a minute while we get reset up here. And as you're learning at this conference, we have a jam-packed program. So if you need coffee or a break, you should feel free